let's come to our quality of focus. And when we focus, our brain, which has two sides, two halves, comes into a heavily bridged neuronal whole and allows us literally to focus our minds in such a way that we can be specific. Part of it is not just the bridging of the two halves of the brain, but the calibration, braiding of those two through the whole neurological network. What occurs is that there are nodes of energy plateaus then, tuned by the braiding in the brain through the neurological system. And those nodes act as chakras. And they are very specific nodes, and they together form a set. And one of the qualities of that set is that it is able to be recalibrated. It is able to be raised in its capacity, and its capacity is to tune energy. The set is an expression of a transcendental personality, colloquially called one's true self. It does have its basis in how we live, in our existence, in our bodies, in our actions, the sets of actions that we do, the rituals. But the protagonist in those actions, in that existence, in this body, the protagonist is our character. A quality of inheritance tempered always by experience. And so that flow of experience has a hero, if you wish, a protagonist, if you like. It is who we are in the way that we really are in our lives, expressed as the way in which we follow experience. And so experience is like a stream that runs in a landscape of existentials, of bodies, of actions. And one of the deep qualities of Hermetic America, about 100 some years ago, was to develop a philosophy of the pragmatic basis upon which experience actually is generated and actually occurs, and is responsive then to improvements in our character, deepening qualities of our character, expansive ways in which our experience looks upon things, and a raising of the aspirations of character to inhabit a larger world, a better world, a better life, and that better life needs to have a whole parfait of shareability. We need to have friends, we need to have family, we need to have communities on several levels, local, regional, national, trans-temporal, in terms of a whole world. That character basis as a flow comes neurologically in the brain, braided and made into a whole, into a mind. And this is natural. It's the way it's done. It's the way it happens. But in the mind, the character now becomes integrated to become an individual. The sense of I, that such and such is me and such is not me. Not that you don't do something because it's ostensibly just because it's bad, but you don't do this sort of thing. Or this is the sort of thing you do. This is the sort of individual that I like to associate with on this level, or maybe on that level, maybe on several of these levels. And so the integral nature of the structure of the mind gets the focus of the character of the experience, and it's a two-way stream, so that the mind then, the individual in the mind, sends back through the flow of experience back to the body, back to the existentials, back to the actions, and refines it and says, well, if I do such and such actions, this fortifies my experience so that it comes to my individuality, and my character is improved enough that it specifies my sense of identity better. I become clearer of who I am. And that whole process then of identification, with the emphasis on I, is the individuality of the cycle then, which is not only complete, but is complete forwards and backwards. One can go back through experience to make adjustments in the rituals, in the existentials, so that when it becomes the basis then of one's experiential character, it improves, and the communication of that cycle forwards and backwards is language. So that language is the communicative carrier of the way in which the tuning and the toning are not only continued, but they are adjusted, hopefully improved. What is being mooted here is that we always find at certain expansions, at certain times, that we have been challenged beyond belief. In our time, in the last 60-some years, we have become aware that what was originally envisioned as science fiction is actually true. Not only are we not alone in the universe, but that we are rather disadvantaged in the universe. We have had trouble just getting off this planet to our moon. And evidently, there are civilizations that travel between the stars quite easily. One of the difficulties came in 1945 because of the successful testing of the first atomic bomb in New Mexico at the Trinity test site in the White Sands area, which sent out a signal, unmistakable, that our species had acquired not only atomic energy, but for those advanced interstellar civilizations who understood, because they also had once upon a time gone through that threshold, that very rapidly after that follows an explosive expansion of that power. The time between the first atomic bomb and the first hydrogen bomb is not very long at all. Just a handful of years. And where the Trinity test site was 20,000 tons of TNT, even the first hydrogen bomb was millions of tons of TNT. Kilotons. And very rapidly after that, by the time of another handful of years, it was verging on an incredible 50 to 100 million tons of TNT. And that was 3 generations ago. So that the scale now of what's at stake for the individuality, what is the context of one's character, what is needed in one's life, one's actions, one's existence, one's body, has suddenly been juiced up to the level to where it is a blur and a chaos. The roots of all of this go back, as we have seen, especially in America, to a peculiarity that happened several thousand years ago and came to a focus 2,000 years ago, but oddly enough came to a preemptive focus about 300 years before that, and that about 2,000 years ago it was apparent to a teacher, Jesus, that there was a braiding of time forms that were unmanageable for our kind without a helping hand, without a guide. The fact that there are 2 different time forms that braid together is like the 2 halves of the brain. The way that they form a single whole is through a massive complexity of communication, which requires then an ever more refined quality of language, and that the refinement can go one of 2 ways. If it goes from the symbolic structure of the mind back through experience to the ritual level, back to the existentials, back to your actions, the sets of actions that one does. If it goes that way, the communication needs to have a rhetorical structure. It must make sense in a way that the character, our character in our experience, understands specifically what this is, and then specifically tailors existentials, pragmatic actions, our bodies of community, so that the communication goes back and makes the changes recommended, the changes necessary. That rhetorical quality of language is structure, integral, and point specific. But the language can go the other way as well, and that is, instead of going back through from the symbolic structure of the mind back through the character of experience back to your existence, it can go forward as well. And when it goes forward, it literally goes out of one's brain. It goes into a space of comprehension, which is generated then in such a way that the wholeness of the two parts of the brain now don't just make a wholeness of the brain in terms of the neurological system, but creates a special space that is larger than the physical structure of the body. It is more expansive and of a different quality and kind from the integral, and this is the generated space of a field of consciousness. In that consciousness is not a specific epiphenomenon of the mind, but it is a transformation of the mind into a field of consciousness, symbolized anciently as a bubble of clarity around one's head, as a holy halo, as a nimbus of openness, and that the blessed then have this extra dimension of not just awareness, but of a remembering recognition field, which is also creatively imaginative. And so consciousness is a fifth dimension. Not just the four dimensions of time and space, but a fifth dimension, the typical word used in English from the Latin, from the Greek, it's quintessential. It's not only essential, it is quintessential. And its quintessentiality in the theater, the colloquial phrase is it's the fifth business. It's the magic of the show. Yes, the theater has its play, it has its director, it has its actors, it has its audience. We have blocked out how the actors are going to move, how the characters in that movement are going to use their language, their emotions, their feeling tones. But even with all that having been done, when it comes to a real performance of it, there is such a thing as the magic of the theater happening. That's the fifth business. That the audience, the actors, the directors, the playwright, the lighting people, everyone understands that tonight's a special night. The great song in the 40s expressing that, there was a showstopper. It's a grand night for singing. The stars are bright above, and everybody here is falling in love. It is the quintessential magic that now life has a special energy in it which can change not only the rituals, not only the existentials, but can transform the mind and can also reach back into the natural field out of which existence comes, the natural field out of which the whole basis of body and actions having definite registry as being real, that the whole field of nature now has a transformative magic dust, and that this changes the entire nature of how a cycle of nature is going to work. But it doesn't stop there. That fifth dimension, because it has a forward momentum, generates a transformed character. The character now is transformed, not just integrated into one's individuality, but you have been pulled through the structure of individuality into a special field of consciousness, And what emerges out of that five-dimensional field of conscious nature is a personality. And so the person becomes a very special, higher registry, a higher energy. And it is not the higher energy of one's individuality, it's the higher energy of your character. It's who your experience really is in terms of the liver of that experience. How you live that experience has now become like a special child to a parent person, and that parent person now has a family relationship, like a mother-son or mother-daughter or father-son, father-daughter. And one says that person, that spiritual person, is one's guardian spirit. The phrase sometimes used around the turn of the century when anthropologists, all the great American Indian anthropologists, most of them were women, and they came to use the term the tutorial spirit, that the guardian spirit is a cut above one's sense of identity in the mind, but is deeply related to one's character. And that because the personality is a very special creative quality, it does not belong to the level of experience that was there before. It doesn't belong to the symbolic structure. It's not limited to the existential body that was or is. And so there's an art to creating a person, a personality. And so that the person is literally an art form. And that art form is not existential. It's not pragmatic. It has a spiritual lensing quality of being able to handle the whole spectrum of possibilities. It is able to take the energy in its entire, like the electromagnetic spectrum, in its entire range. And so the art of person making, that personality is prismatic in terms of its transforming qualities. And the prismatic quality of the art of the person now becomes a complement to the pragmatic actions that are taken in response to, in referentiality to, the way in which the individuality in its mental assessment needs to do. But the focus is that the basis of the person is the character in your experience. And so one of the great Hermetic Americans who helped develop pragmatism was John Dewey. And one of his greatest books was called Art and Experience. That one needs to calibrate to the fact that there is a rainbow always operating with art. And that the basis of the rainbow is no longer ritual existence or ritual actions, but is the creative transform of them. And that the basis of the whole frame of reference, if you will, of art, is that its basis now is not on just things and limited actions, but its basis is upon the experience of the character developing images that have feeling tones and developing a language which is expressive forwards and backwards, but especially is forward-looking because it's learning from one's own personality. Now, one has a mature personality who is an older friend, a higher friend, helps guide, helps teach, helps give that tutorial sense. And what comes out of that is that the cycles of nature that were definitely cycles, and they definitely needed to be cycles, and they were cycles, are now toned and tuned in a new way so that they are now ecologies. That one can understand that all of those cycles can network together to make a larger super strategic ecology, so that life now becomes ecologically recognizant. And one of the things about Hermetic America is that this was one of the first places to have individuality transformed into spirit personality guide over 300 years ago already. And as we saw, the first person to really do this in spades was Benjamin Franklin. And the first person to really understand Franklin in the full rainbow of his personality, of his prismatic, improvable achievement, was Thomas Jefferson. So that all of a sudden you had the beginnings of a different kind of a lineage, not a lineage in a line, but a lineage of resonances. And the integrity of a lineage in a line is that the line is unbroken. Whereas the quality of a resonance relationality is a harmonic that is not dependent upon any kind of contact immediately. It's one can inherit from anybody who has ever achieved a spirit personality. They become a resource for you, no matter how long ago they lived, or where they lived, or what race they were, what gender they were. They become a part of the harmonic of your prismatic person. And as William James said in one of his letters, William James is one of the other founders of pragmatism. William James said, "The mind has no shores once the psychology has transformed itself into a parapsychology." And James, who wrote the world's first textbook on psychology, 2 huge volumes, I brought them in a couple of presentations ago. He worked on it from 1878 and finally published it. He worked on it teaching at Harvard. He was the founder of the psychology department there. And in 1890, William James's psychology established him as one of the great thinkers of all time. James's psychology was as important as Darwin's Origin of Species, because it was the first time that one had, in a rhetorical exactness, the complete catalog of the way in which the character of experience is integrable to symbolic structures of the mind. And as soon as he finished that, and it was 1,400 pages, he assumed at the time that it was only going to be read by a handful of people. It became a bestseller, but people were struggling with it because of its complexity and scope. So 2 years later, he came out with the briefer course, a little 300-page book, and it became a bestseller all over the world. And one of the qualities in 1892, when William James's Psychology, the briefer course came out, and by the way, these books have been in print all the time since then. Dover paperbacks reprinted them. They're still in print. One of the readers of psychology in the big 2 volumes was Freud. Another reader later on was Carl Jung. And that you find the development of Freudian psychology, the development of Jungian psychology, all have a responsiveness to William James' psychology. But James went even further. He became one of the founding members of the Psychical Research Society that bridged London and New York and Boston and the continent, and that these individuals began to try to explore those dimensions of consciousness that are beyond the psychology into the realm of a parapsychology. And what they found was that in terms of psychology, one can be specific. One can be integral, one can have a shape which is rhetorically accurate. But in parapsychology, it is a sabotaging detriment to carry that over into that dimension. That it becomes like an anchor where you're trying to sail out of harbor into the ocean and your anchor is not letting you go. And that the anchor is absolutely necessary in the harbor. That's how it keeps you anchored, keeps you safe. So that one of the jeopardies that came up, that unless you went through some extraordinary experience, like a vision quest, or you were some kind of a very special person like a yogi, the average normal human being, when it comes to letting go of that anchor and sailing out there into those uncharted vistas, this is a scary thing. And the scare of it is akin to the scare of facing death. So that there came to be an understanding that one of the great traditional anchors that all kinds of human beings have developed over thousands of years, that the symbolic structure, rhetorically, of codifying and agreeing that these actions are going to keep us safe, that this experience is viable both ways. It can go into the existence of things and of actions. It can also go into the orderliness of our minds, and our experience is free to flow in between them. One of the bindings of that cycle, keeping it as an anchor, is religion. Every religion has that purpose and does that very well for those whose experience is within the parentheses of that rhetorical, symbolic structure and those existential actions and things. And as long as that is kept religio, bound together as a set in a whole, one is safe. The difficulty then is that anything outside of that is potentially unsafe. And so one has to be coaxed to step forth, to step out. Not just to color outside the lines, but to realize that color doesn't need lines. And so right at the time that you find William James becoming world famous, not just as a psychologist, but as a philosopher, he wrote one of the all-time bestsellers, it's still in print as well, called The Varieties of Religious Experience. That there is no need for us to be fearful of the unknown, parapsychologically, because if we do a comparison of all the different religious traditions, they all have within them the possibilities of assuring you that stepping out does not mean that you're going to fall off the world of the real. Because God is not limited to our individuality, not limited to existential body shapes, not an experience that is only parentheses between them, but is free to enjoy the dimensions not only of consciousness, but the sixth dimension, as one could say, of a spiritual personality. And that spiritual personality now, what it is capable of doing is generating a seventh dimension process, which is the kaleidoscopic consciousness of history, which has nothing whatsoever to do with being founded in terms of a mythic horizon of experience, but has everything to do with the creative development of one's person with other persons, generating a furthering dimension of transform and of making history, which is radically different from having an identification process be successful. When one makes history, one opens up then further possibilities that were not there before. Now, those possibilities participate as much in the real as any kind of anchored cycle ever did. So that history not only frees one's self, but it also exposes oneself to wider world, wider universe. And we'll see when we come back from the break that this has become in the last 60 years an extremely fearful, delicate thing. Because by back engineering alien technologies, the United States developed what has commonly been looked at as the looking glass, the ability to see forwards and backwards in time by an alien technology back engineered from certain instruments found on recovered spacecraft, flying saucers, UFOs. And that's so scary, was it, that all of this has since been dismantled in the sense of being portioned out to groups that are disparate so that no one can put that technology back together again, because one of the qualities that scared them was this. This is from Project Looking Glass. You can find this on the web. Project Camelot is the website. Apparently, images of the events at different places relative to the location of the device can be picked up and in essence reflected off the gas, causing it to behave like a teleprompter or crystal ball, for lack of a better example. But I'm not entirely sure that mass does not move or that the mass is not affected, since I was also told many years ago about an experiment that went very wrong in the early years of the LG Looking Glass project. This is a man named Bill Hamilton, an old engineer. As I understand it, there was a significant movement of mass during that experiment, and it ended up with a rather gruesome death for the poor test subject. I originally thought it was a monkey, but I found out that there were many test subjects that were sent through. So I am not certain what kind was involved in the experiment that went bad. What they found was that whoever is there operating this affects the way in which the future or the past occurs. That the person is a real dimension in a wider reality than space-time. That the dimension of consciousness, as every good yogi, every good contemplative who understands the power of prayer, every good visionary who understands the opening up of the mind to the shoreless dimensions of creative remembering, knows that we affect what is real. Not every single individual, but each prismatic person contributes to the kaleidoscopic spectrum of that expansive whole. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the way in which about 100 years ago was a confluence focused on the United States of a most intense kind, that so much incredible experience had happened in the 200 years of America by that time, that a special, unheard of energy, a power of transform, a quality of the population had developed to the very threshold to which every next increment was going to be an increasing increment. And it would go faster and faster, wider and wider, more and more and more powerful. And the fearfulness of it was one of the contributors to the First World War, to the scariness of the Great War, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and instead started a war which has been going on ever since. There have been only lulls in something that has continued. Next week, when we take a look at the way in which American literature especially expressed this, when he got the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954, William Faulkner, in his speech said, "There has never been a real peace since the First World War, because right near the end of what was supposed to be the end of the First World War, there was a revolt, a revolution among the troops on the trench lines between both the Allies and the Germans, and that men on both sides refused any further to kill each other." Now, this really happened. And this scared the generals on both sides more than defeat would have, because it meant there are not soldiers anymore. And you can't fight wars if human beings refuse to kill each other on the basis of consciousness that is shared. Let's take a break. Let's come back to what we're looking at, and we're looking in such a way that we layer. And we layer not only for a practical, pragmatic reason, but for a prismatic, resonant truthfulness. The meaning is both in the reason and in the larger quality of the prismatic resonance. Traditionally, one says that a language which is integral, cycle, specific, and referential is a rhetorical structure, whereas a language which originates by making the symbolic structure transparent so that one's experience flows through the transparency of the mind into the field of consciousness and generates the prismatic person, we say of that language that it is poetic. So that there is a watershed. It is colloquially called prose and poetry. Good prose is specific. It has a structure, and its structure will always appeal to one's experience of the plot line. It will have a beginning, it will have its middles, it will have its end. It will be a composition which is rhetorically specific and structured so that one can sum it up with the themes that are developed into the synthesizing ideas that are able to be thought. And if the ideas are clean and pure, they will have a natural relationship to the plot lines of the experience, and they will have an effect in your life of what you do and things that are existentially around you. And this is the way that then everything becomes coherent. But a poetic is of a radically different quality. It is not of an integral quality, but a differentiating quality. And so we call it a differential consciousness. American poetry is one of the world's greatest poetries for a differential conscious poetic. And we have been looking at some of the origins of it in the 19th century. We specifically looked at Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, just to take a man and a woman poet who have become icons in world literature of some of the most original great literature of all time. Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Emily Dickinson's collected poetry. And we looked at how one of the developers of Emily Dickinson's scintillating imagery was the great American poet Amy Lowell. And Amy Lowell's poetry that came after Emily Dickinson's poetry was literally rediscovered for the first time was an expression of the genius of American poetry that finally emerged in the 1920s with poets like E.E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, etc. A great age of poetry. The most famous Hermetic American poet of that whole era that came into the 1950s and 60s was Wallace Stevens, who was the vice president of the Hartford Accident and Insurance Indemnity Company in Hartford, Connecticut, who not only was an executive CEO, he was one of the great poets of all time and would write his poems on the commuter train to work in his creative imagination. And when he would arrive at his big executive office, the executive secretary, her first act of the day was to take down the poem of the day, which he would recite to her. Picture perfect. Here's one of his great Hermetic American visionary poems, just a few lines just to give you the tone. This is called The Sides on the Oboe. The oboe is a musical instrument that one plays off to the side. It has a peculiar, haunting timbre to its tone. The prologues are over. It is a question now of final belief. So say that final belief must be in a fiction. It is time to choose. That obsolete fiction of the wide river in an empty land, the gods that Boucher killed and the metal heroes that time granulates, the philosopher's man alone still walks in dew. Still by the seaside mutters milky lines concerning an immaculate imagery. If you say on that hautboy, man is not enough, can never stand as God, is ever wrong, in the end, however naked, tall, there is still the impossible possible philosopher's man. The man who has had the time to think enough, the central man, the human globe, responsive as a mirror with a voice, a the man of glass who in a million diamonds sums us up. This is the prismatic person coming forth in Hermetica America literature that began to literally lead the planet in being able to express a tradition which by the time Wallace Stevens was able to write and publish this kind of a poetry was already 250 years after Benjamin Franklin's birth. The difficulty was that America did not begin with a Benjamin Franklin. Hermetic America did, with him literally raising himself since he was a young teenager. He wrote his anonymous, silent, do-good letters when he was about 14, 15 years old, and had them published in his brother's paper, was an indentured young apprentice to his brother's paper, the New England Courant. And he had taught himself how to write because he had learned to read as a very young boy and because he was born as a universal genius and had taken as a model the English literary newspaper, The Spectator, and literally tried to write exactly how these sophisticated British authors in The Spectator, Joseph Addison, etc., to express what was there. And then he would read a new article himself, a new essay, think about it for a couple of days, and then try on his own to write what he remembered of the essay in Spectator style. And as he grew, even by the time he was 12, 13 years old, he was able to take for himself ever increasingly sophisticated qualities of writing. Great writers like Jonathan Swift, Daniel Defoe, lions, literary lions of those days. And Franklin literally taught himself how to do these things, but in doing so, he began to realize that in order to keep a shape to what he was doing, he needed to also keep track of himself. And he ran across a technique which eventually one can trace back to Pythagoras. An ancient technique that to train oneself is almost like being a spiritual athlete. You have to pay attention to all the different aspects and refine a number of different aspects and coordinate them together so that when it came game time, performance time, one was ready to exercise all of them ensemble. So he found 14 personality traits, not individual traits, not just character traits, but improvable personality traits. And so he made a list of all 14. Then he made a little grid of each day of the week. And he kept track. How did I do on this day? On this, the same day, this the same day, then the next day, then the next day. So he began to graph these 14 personality traits and keep track of the way in which he was gaining adept qualities of not only being able to recognize his own person and personality, but to keep improving it. And he found that what improved it most was a combination, almost like a yin-yang, that one had to improve the pragmatic actions that one actually did at the same time as pair them in a tuned way with the prismatic possibilities of keeping them open for further improvements. Literally, we would say now, he developed a software that is improvable by algorithms of refinement. And that the refinement doesn't just come from oneself, it comes from others like oneself who in honest discussions together increase the possibility of having better improvements. And that if that community now is expanded so that it's larger, the improvements come faster and are more refined. And also because they are shared in their genesis, they are shareable even more to a community that is educated to understand the process, so that they're able to be included. Not as those who are conquered by, or convinced by, or cajoled by, or bought, but those who are participating together. That is a shareable community. And on that basis, one has outclassed the rhetorical structures that largely go into keeping what previously were thought to be the only safe places. So that more and more the Hermetic Americans realized that the safe places are to keep expanding the frontier. Not only keep moving west, but to keep moving higher, to keep moving deeper, to keep improving the shareability. And so the American experience became more and more one of a population who were becoming not just sophisticated in old world terms, they were becoming freer in new world possibilities. But in the 19th century, there began to be a lag because the success of America was so magnetic that more and more groups of people were coming not for freedom, but to make money. So that the immigrant population increasingly was a diluting of the American experience to a very low common denominator of we just want to make money. So one of the critiques written in 1906 by the already famous H.G. Wells, sort of an honorary Hermetic American, called The Future in America, A Search After Realities. By the time of 1906, H.G. Wells was one of the most famous novelists in the world. His first smash hit was The Time Machine in 1895, which he followed the next year with The Island of Dr. Moreau, which he followed the next year with The Invisible Man, which he followed the next year with The War of the Worlds. It seemed like every year, like a rock star, H.G. Wells came out with something fantastic that nobody had ever read before, this sort of thing. And one of the qualities of H.G. Wells was that he didn't stop. And one of the most poignant, though little known until just a few years ago, When the Sleeper Wakes, the story of the years to come, of a man who goes into a coma for 200 years. And he wakes up in the London of 2100. He goes to sleep into this trance. The novel was published in 1899, so Wells put it as 1900. So he wakes up in 2100, and it turns out that he has become a religious icon in his coma state in this glass receptacle to keep him warm, to keep him untampered with, to keep him fed and so forth. And when he wakes up, it takes him a while to understand that he has been the recipient of 200 years of people bequeathing their fortunes to him. He is the richest man in history. He owns almost everything. And they're not sure the keepers are not sure how to treat him because he really is more powerful than anyone has ever been on the planet in actual monetary terms. The reprint, When the Sleeper Awakes, was revised by Wells in 1910, and he called it then The Sleeper Awakes. And in 1921, he revised it a little bit again, and it was republished in the United States by the University of Nebraska Press in the year 2000. 2000 is halfway between 1900 and 2100, and this is a reprint with the commemorative edition forward by a great science fiction writer and afterwards and so forth. The quality of Wells by 1906, where he had published another 10 books, was not only to write these novels of science fiction and beginning novels of human complications, Love and Mr. Lewisham, but to write non-fiction critiques of the world. And one of the first was called Anticipations. But he published a book which William James called one of the most important books. He said the first two parts of it should be college reading text for the entire world. It's called First and Last Things, A Confession of Faith and the Rule of Life. And its preview was published as New Worlds for Old in 1908, but in 1906, the quality of the future in America has this kind of a critique. Will the reader please remember that I've just been a few weeks in the States altogether and value my impressions at that, and will be nevertheless read of doubts that won't diminish. I doubt very much if America is going to assimilate all that she is taking in now. And this is a chapter called The Immigrants. Will America be able to assimilate not only a lot of immigrants, but a torrential flow of immigrants? And he reads this way. It's 102 years ago. I believe she is going to find infinite difficulties in that task. By assimilate, I mean make intelligently cooperative citizens of these people. She will, I have no doubt whatever, impose upon them a bare use of the English language and give them votes and certain patriotic persuasions. But I believe that if things go on as they are going, the great mass of them will remain a very lower class, will remain largely illiterate, industrialized peasants. They are descendant-minded peasant people, orderly, industrious people, rather dirty in their habits and with a low standard of life. Whenever they accumulate in numbers, they present to my eyes a social phase far below the level of either England, France, North Italy, Switzerland. Frankly, I do not find the American nation has either in its schools, which are as backward in some states as they are forward in others, in its press, the religious bodies or general tone, any organized means or effectual influences for raising these huge masses of humanity to the requirements of an ideal modern civilization. They are, to my mind, biting off more than they can chaw in this matter. Then he goes on to say, it is well known in Europe by 1906 that the wealth and power of America has been so sudden in terms of the long history of kingdoms, the long history of nations, the enormous length of civilizations, that America in just a generation or two has become literally the strongest economic power that the world has ever seen. And we need to understand here and remember that the Civil War fought between 1860 and 1865 was the first modern industrialized war, where the industrial-sized weaponry produced killing on a colossal scale. More than 1 million men died in the American Civil War in little over 4 years. The quality of the wealth from there until the beginning of 1900, in that short period of time, one of the great books by a Hermetic American named Mark Twain was called The Gilded Age, published in 1892. The Gilded Age, a tale of today, fully illustrated with new designs, and it's all about the incredible wealth and power that is accruing, but not only accruing, not just for a population of people, but increasingly for a oligarchy of trusts that buy companies. Anything that is successful, they come in and buy those companies, incorporate them then in their hierarchical structure so that fewer and fewer trusts become more and more powerful in owning the very basis of the whole cycle, from how people think about what should be done, what it is that they are told to do, and they do because it needs to be done, and the way in which experience, parentheses between those two, becomes recognizable because you stand out if you're different. You become an outsider radically, immediately, and you become a danger. And you become ostracized, and you become a stranger. And that one is very filled with the trepidation then, which reinforces a natural trepidation that it's fearful to go into the unknown. Now it is socially dangerous to go to new things. Not only new ideas, but to go beyond ideas into new visions of what is possible. And so that increasingly there is a proliferation of the visionary Hermetic Americans, and there is an anti-visionary, feudal, medieval Americans who increasingly, for their comfort, go back to models of empire. So that the United States, by the time of 1914, the beginning of the Great War, were filled with a trepidation of whether to get involved or not get involved, and it wasn't about the peace process. It was about the nature of America. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, wrote a particular indelible little book, which has never been reprinted, is never talked about. Wilson was the president of Princeton University for a while, and one of the great distinguished alumni of Princeton was Lawrence Rockefeller, who was my patron for a long time. And he was invited to give a speech at Princeton for the graduating class of his day, and he was giving $30 million to Princeton for new centers of the study of democratic institutions. And he wanted to have notes to deliver a speech on Woodrow Wilson, and I provided a series of notes for that. The book, little book, and I'll bring it next week, by Woodrow Wilson was called When a Man Comes to Himself. When a man is able, or a woman, when a human being is able to come to one's sense of identity that is transparent, one sees through to the person that one could be. If you improved yourself, this is very much like the young Benjamin Franklin, keeping track, keeping graphing. And what's interesting is that the modern computer networking is all about that ability to keep one constantly updating and improving not only the software, not only the networking of it, but your facility to understand uses of it that were not thought of before, and by adding into the ecology of improvability, which increases not only the quality, but advances the speed. So that the speed of change gets to a certain threshold where it becomes supersonic. It becomes faster than what one can hear about it. That it is not possible to keep up with it with the hearing of the ear. One can only keep up with it with the ability to have like an intuitive, visionary consciousness of what is going on in the spectrum of possibilities. And it is this ecological consciousness that becomes kaleidoscopic in terms of history. That history is being made now, not just occasionally, not just by a few, but is being made continuously by many. One of the earliest expressions of this was in 1908. William James was 66 years old, and he published a book called A Pluralistic Universe. He would die in August of 1910, just a couple of years later. Lecture 7 is entitled The Continuity of Experience. Now, experience on the mythic level has a beginning, middle, and end to all of its sets. Experience is, well, I had that experience, and this is the recounting of it, and this is what I learned from it. The continuity of experience. William James. I fear that few of you will have been able to obey Henri Bergson's call upon you to look forwards towards the sensational life for the fuller knowledge of reality, or to sympathize with his attempt to limit the divine right of concepts to rule our minds absolutely. It is too much like looking downwards and not up. Philosophy, you will say, doesn't lie flat on its belly in the middle of experience, in the very thick of its sand and gravel, as this Bergsonianism does, never getting a peep at anything from above. Philosophy is essentially the vision of things from above. It doesn't simply feel the detail of things. It comprehends their intelligible plan, sees their forms and principles, their categories and rules, their order and necessity. It takes the superior point of view of the architect. It is conceivable that it should ever forsake that point of view and abandon itself to a slovenly life of immediate feeling. To say nothing of your traditional Oxford devotion to Aristotle and Plato, the leaven of T.H. Green probably works still too strong here for his anti-sensationalism to be outgrown quickly. Green, more than anyone, realized that knowledge about things was knowledge of their relations. And he goes on from there, and A Pluralistic Universe became an international seller. And it raised William James to one of the levels in the world that was peculiar at the time. Because the most painstaking delineator of the American character, especially the American character in Europe, American wealthy travelers in Europe, American wealthy upper class owners, new owners of villas, new owners of castles because they could buy them. If you want, he's one of Wells's critiques, the wealthy American will say, I don't want that size of Monet. It won't fit where I want to put it. Have him paint something this size and I will buy it. The great novelist was Henry James, William James' brother. And Henry James was the most painstaking detailer of the qualities of character that express themselves in certain images, embody certain feeling tones, utilize a certain quality of rhetorical language, but all presented in a very high poetic language of the author, Henry James. So that the characters in the novel are prosaic, rich individuals, whereas the author is a kaleidoscopic historical jewel of a writer. And Henry and William James, being raised together with a couple of brothers and a sister who was never, Alice was never able to endure the childhood that they had, and ended up being in a permanent mental care home. She died in her early 50s. They were all raised by Henry James Sr., who force-fed those children, especially the two boys, William and Henry James. They were expected to be reading Greek when they were 4 years old, to be able to write in Latin when they were 4 years old, to get ready to be sent to schools in Germany and France, and so you have to learn these languages too, as well as excellent English, as well as some Italian and some Spanish, so that they were force-fed to become geniuses. And one of the difficulties for William James is that he had a very sophisticated veneer of his individuality, and they were raised on the campus and environs of Harvard University. So they were Harvard, Boston Brahmin, intellectual geniuses from the crib. In order for William James to try to get outside of himself, to get a little different experience, one of the European scientific geniuses, Louis Agassiz, who was teaching at Harvard, was taking an expedition down to the Amazon jungles in Brazil. He's going to take a special expedition, and because of the ties of the James family around Harvard, young William James, just turning from his adolescent teenage years into the young man of 20, was accepted and taken along. But on the way down on the ocean, crossing down, it was different from going to Europe. He'd been taken several times as the boys, as the family were. They were used to going to England, they were used to going to France, they were used to going to Germany, etc. Yes, we know Rome, we know Paris, we've been there, we do this all the time. But going down to South America was going the other way on the earth. It was going down into the southern hemisphere a long way. And when they got into the harbor of Rio de Janeiro, William James became mortally ill. High fever, craziness. He was in the hospital for days on end. They were ready to book special passage to send him back to Boston, when the young William James shakily came in and asked Professor Agassiz if he could continue being a part of the expedition, but that he had seen that maybe what would be useful to the expedition was, because James had grown up understanding how to handle boats and so forth, as good Boston area people do, Agassiz agreed to let the young William James be not only a part of the expedition, but that when they went into the Amazon River, into the jungles, that James would be able to take a native guide by himself, and the two of them on their own canoe would be able to go and collect examples and samples away from the expedition. And so William James became the first American to experience the primordial wilderness, not of North America, but of South America, of the Amazon. He had a shamanic episode of understanding that what he had come through no longer the same that he was. He was no longer a Boston area boy. He was no longer a James son. He was a different quality of person, and he began to open himself up with the native guide to the Amazon jungle scale of the unknown. We'll take a look next week when we come back at the way in which this began by the early 1850s to change the nature of the Hermetic America experience. Because there was another young man very similar to William James who became transformed by being in the openness of the world's oceans, and his name was Herman Melville. And so you began to have a generation of Hermetic Americans who were at home in an entire global unknown openness. And they became some of the first people on the planet to understand that there were not only no shores to the mind, there's no shore to the possibilities of what human beings could become. More next week.